Tactical analysis has become a massive part of the football landscape in the internet age. There are endless YouTube channels, blogs, Twitter pages dedicated to this kind of analysis, but it seems like this view can be a little bit misleading to an actual understanding of how football develops, because it generally relies on ideas. But that's bullshit, at least according to Marx.
And this is the guy, I forget the name, some player that they had there. Messi. This was the guy.
Sarri ball, Wenger ball, tiki-taka, catenaccio, total football, Brexit ball, Allegri ball. These are the kind of ideas which I'm talking about, which people use to describe football's development over time in different locations. There's this popular belief that one of these football ideologies becomes dominant and then meets an oppositional idea and has to adapt to its rival, creating progress. But we can even think of how people view defensive football and attacking football as playing off of each other. Let's take Italian catenaccio in the 1960s, which figures out how to stop good players from scoring by having one of the three centre-backs go to man mark while one of the other centre-backs covers his arse in case he gets beaten. This effectively double marks out any talented players. Then Total Football in the 1970s figures out how to bypass this by playing with the quick passing combinations and interchanging players' positions so that you can't man mark and cover without losing your shape, meaning the catenaccio can no longer defend a specific player like it used to. However, Zona Mista, another Italian invention in like the 80s, 90s, figures out how to surpass Total Football's puzzle by borrowing from the catenaccio. If the man marker gets dragged out of position, then another defender will step into the vacant zone, which has just been left open, rather than just simply covering the same man. So attackers have a new problem where the swapping positions doesn't create space anymore because the opposition are defending zonally. But then, positional play comes about in Spain in the noughties to 2010s, as attackers can very specifically spread themselves out on the pitch so that no more than two players will end up in a specific lane on the pitch. By doing this, they've made it so that they can have certain passing options while moving up the pitch in triangles, which can go around any two players who are attempting to man mark and zonally cover you, because you now have three attacking options whenever it comes to moving the ball forward, which overloads two defensive players. The attackers had responded to Zona Mista's zonal marking with zonal attacking. And what I've just described is pretty much a dialectic, more specifically an idealist dialectic, which looks at how one idea clashes with another idea, usually an opposing idea, to force a resolution. These ideas find some kind of conflict, like in a football match, and will need to address the resulting knowledge from that conflict to progress the ideal, usually adding to the complexity of the understanding of the whole. So, according to this way of thinking, football itself progresses as an attacking idea, comes into conflict with a defensive idea, and resolves with a fuller understanding of football on the whole. And this is basically what Hegel thought was happening in the development of society as well, which is a massive oversimplification, but we won't get into the complexities of Hegel here because it's just a bit much. But pretty famously, Karl Marx disagrees.
Fucking be off flying away next fucking week. He don't hurt you. You're fucking picking a wage up. That's a load of bollocks. You've got to fucking die to get 3 points.
So the idealist says that ideas clash and develop out of their tension. But Marx says, whoa, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, lads. But in a German accent from the 19th century. Well, Marx wants to add on something here where he says, actually, our ideas are the product of our material experience with the world around us. So we are products of what happens to us, and that affects how we think, and that affects how we create those ideas. To really explain this, we need to break down football to its most basic level to really understand what Marx is getting at. Nowadays, your first thought of football is probably at its highest level. In the Santiago Bernabeu, as Barcelona players prepare to take on the Real Madrid squad in front of thousands and thousands of people. But that is football with all of its bells and whistles. Football is as much you and your friends finding a scrap of grass in the schoolyard with a shitty football, which is probably losing air pressure, and setting up some coats for makeshift goalposts. And your players probably are wearing like school shoes, and the teams get split up by 2 self-appointed captains who had to pick 2 reluctant goalkeepers. You flip a coin, a side is picked, probably done without the sun in your eyes, and you start playing the game. This is football in its most bare bones production. All of the fancy additions we associate with top-level football have been stripped back, and we see that the only thing that's really needed for the production of football is some kind of a pitch, some kind of a ball, and people to play it. The pitch and the ball are our essential materials for the production of football at this basic level. Then we have the people who turn that scrap of grass and that shitty football into a game of football through their efforts, what Marx would call labor, which sounds simple, but there's something a little bit more complex going on here. We can break the production of football down into 2 parts. The tools we end up using on the materials we have available to us to create a football match, and the way in which we organize ourselves to play football. The tools for football's production can sound a little vague, but let's think of the shitty football, the bad shoes, the makeshift goalposts from before. Those are all tools that those school kids will use to produce a basic level of football. But we can improve those tools by getting a nicer football, by getting better shoes, by getting real goalposts, which all contribute to making a better production of football, a more developed production of football. But this can even come down to how those players train and how they eat to become better footballers themselves, and how they develop better techniques, which itself is also almost like a new tool. But with all of those new tools, the lads need to organize themselves in a particular way to use those tools for an improved production of football. Like with those techniques and that new football post and that better ball and those new shoes, well, the players actually look around at each other and they say it's kind of actually difficult to organize training sessions just on the fly, so they appoint one person who is now going to be responsible for training all of the other players, a coach. That coach is now tasked with the general organization of the players to ensure the training is helping to make all of the players better footballers, and that then should allow them to produce a better version of football. But with that, the coach has changed his relationship to all the other players, because now he has taken on a specific task in organizing the others. He actually distances himself from the playing of football and now oversees other people who play football. So the relations to produce football have now developed from what they previously were. Those schoolboys have gone from the most basic mode of football to a more complicated mode of football, with the aim of producing better results through improved tools and improved organization. But it is good to remember, even with all those tools and all that organization, it all relies on the materials they have available to them. The pitch, the ball, all that kind of stuff, to even get started. Because those materials are like the clay, which provides the starting point to even imagine a game of football. And we can even, use an example like, say, the development of certain tools which get used on those materials will create a certain tension with the relationship of the players, which will be resolved and produce a new mode of football. Like we said before, the training of players was difficult when you had all those new tools, but no one who necessarily was able to lead the usage and the organization of those tools. So the players got together and they decided to elect a coach. And that came about because there was a material need to create that position. This was a material dialectic at play, where a set of material conditions create the need to develop. But we can keep going with this and start to think about what goes on to keep football being produced consistently as it gets more complex through its development. Again, let's say these football lads from that team that we were talking about before have decided to enter a football league. That league will have an organizational body which sets rules for how each team has to play in the league. They will specify how big the pitch can be, what kind of training facilities you have to provide, and how many players you're allowed to have in the actual squad. By doing this, the organizational bodies create a uniformed way in which clubs and individuals will have to produce their football. They will even send a bloke to your matches, a referee, who ensures your players are acting as they should, and will get punished if they don't do so. And this governance goes on at different levels. You have your national organizations like the FAs, which will oversee football production at a national level. You'll have your continental organizational bodies who oversee the production of football of whole continents. And you'll have the global organizational body, FIFA, who oversees the production of football pretty much everywhere, or theoretically at least. But in our minds, we kind of end up assuming that these organizational bodies come into play first before football even really exists. But for Marx, that's inaccurate, because these organizational bodies, much like states, are there to maintain football's production in the same way as was already established. You only even need these kind of bodies when football has become so complex that you need to have someone larger to oversee it on a league level, on a national level, or even on a continental level. And this can kind of lead us to another question, which asks, who has control over these organizational bodies? I mean, it's not necessarily inherently the fans, it's not inherently the players, but it's whoever holds power over the means of football's production. Whoever is the one controlling the way football is being produced will have a big say in how football gets reproduced in those organizational bodies. And in the way many clubs are currently structured, that is a wealthy owner who owns all the materials and all the tools for football's production and has gained control of all the contracts of the players, the managers, the coaches, and all other staff at the football club, holding all of these things as private property. And the value from owning these clubs really comes from holding the power over the means of football's production through private property ownership. So when it comes to what the organizational bodies are trying to reproduce, it's football as those wealthy owners want it, because they are the ones who actually hold power in the current mode of football. The interests of the owners become the interests of the organizational bodies by the fact the owners hold material control over the initial production of football, which the organizational bodies work to reproduce. We can then think about another part of football's reproduction, which comes along with the organizational bodies: football's cultural institutions. We can think of the FIFA video games, the documentaries about football, podcasts about football, analysis about football, memes about football. They all talk about football as it is and represent a certain view of football. At least that's what most of it will do. We can think of culture here like a reflection of the base elements of football that we were talking about before, as culture will represent the mode of football being played at that moment. So culture ends up being this delayed, possibly surface level mirroring of how football might be produced at that time. And it will probably end up reproducing that current mode of football because it ends up teaching us about that specific mode of football as if it's the natural way of doing things, or even the best way of doing things, which is a very brief and reductive way to summarize all of culture. But we can generally say that the most popular stuff culturally will usually represent the mode of football at the current moment and will present it as being good, unless things are quite unstable and there's a lot of, material change happening, which could then mean that there will be cultural questions, with pop culture becoming a reflection of that material dialectical tension. But just to recap a little bit, we have those base elements of football which are essential to the production of football, but then we have these political and cultural institutions which are helpful towards the reproduction of football. And we went on a long journey here, so you're probably asking, what does this have to do with football's tactical development? And hopefully we can answer that now. So, as we said before, football idealism suggests that football develops based upon ideas like tactical approaches. But what we've just set out thinks about things a little bit differently. We can put up a diagram which describes what we would call a football materialist base superstructure model. Football must first be interpreted on a material pitch through the relations and tools people use to produce a certain mode of football. And here we can see tension develop between different material conditions. Changes in those things create a tension or an instability or even a crisis, which we must resolve to keep producing football and should lead to football's development by resolving those tensions. Let's say our lads football club takes the tactical approach at playing total football. We could say that even being able to play total football is not driven purely by, a response to the tensions of Catenaccio. It as much comes about from the developments in, training new players, possibly new tools which are available for training players or, for the football club in general, and even new information about how to condition players physically, which will hopefully then lead to them being better footballers in general. You then come up with a new set of relations with, a bigger coaching staff, maybe a chef, maybe a developed youth academy that can teach young players total footballing principles from a younger age. And maybe you can even hire a groundskeeper who maintains the pitch, so a better quality of football can be produced consistently. For the idea of total football to even develop, we kind of require a certain set of material conditions to be present to even realize that idea's development in reality. This is what Marx means whenever he takes issue with idealism, which doesn't appreciate how our experience with the material world is a fundamental presupposition to the form of our consciousness, and a material analysis can end up revealing how our surroundings, our material surroundings, have ended up influencing our thoughts and ideas. It allows us to see the systems around us which might have informed our consciousness. For example, the tactical ideals of a manager rely on a whole series of factors which come before even stepping out on the football pitch. What did the coach material experience as a player? How good are your training facilities? Can you recruit the players you need for the style of play you want to play with? Do you have the money to recruit those players? It even goes right down to having the right diet in place for a player to be physically primed to perform at that top level. Looking at what happens on the surface of the pitch and not what goes on beyond the pitch is kind of like looking at a clock face and not realizing there's a whole series of mechanisms below it which allow the clock to function. So the development of football actually relies heavily on all those material factors to even allow for a tactical development to occur on the pitch.
And there is the final whistle. Tottenham's long record of lack of success at Anfield goes on thanks to a decisive second half goal scored by Ray Kennedy. Liverpool 2, Tottenham Hotspur.
So this materialist analysis that we're talking about allows us to find out how things have developed on a deeper level than just the ideas which end up appearing on the surface. As the diagram showed before, we can look at where the materials are, how it's being used, and how the people are being organized to get the best out of it. However, it's important to remember that human decision-making is still a massively important part of this. We still have a consciousness of our material surroundings. We can still choose how we end up doing things. That is why I think it's good to say that there is no definitive way to develop necessarily. Just because football has developed in one way doesn't mean it has to continue developing that way, or that it has to continue developing in any other particular way. That's why in one of my next videos, I want to look at Marx's critique of how we end up structuring society and how we have told ourselves stories about how things will inevitably develop or how things have to develop and have always been that way. Probably not the next video, but maybe one of the ones after that, just so I can spice things up a little bit.